"This is my husband's house now," my stepmother said calmly, standing in the doorway as if she belonged there more than I ever did. "You're no longer welcome here." I stared at her, still wearing the black dress I wore to my father's memorial, my hands tightly gripping the urn that held his ashes. My feet felt like they were sinking into the hardwood floor, as if the house itself was rejecting me. I blinked once, trying to understand the absurdity of what I just heard. "Excuse me," I said, but my voice barely rose above a whisper. Susan didn't flinch. "There's nothing left here for you, Laura. Your father is gone. This is my home now and my son will be moving in. You'll need to make other arrangements." I looked behind her, past the freshly painted hallway, to the staircase I used to race down as a child, to the living room where my father taught me how to play chess, to the fireplace, where we hung stockings every Christmas. Every memory in that house had my name etched into it, and now it was being handed over to strangers like a cheap motel room. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, not out of desperation, but disbelief. Susan's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't know. Maybe back to your little apartment, or wherever you came from before you moved back here to play nurse. Your part is done." I didn't cry. I didn't scream or argue. I simply nodded. "Okay," I said. And then I smiled. Not because I was fine, not because it didn't hurt. I smiled because I had spent enough time around lawyers to know that nothing in this world is permanent, especially not the kind of power that people think they have. I turned and walked out, the urn still cradled in my arms, stepping into the cold wind without a word. But that smile wasn't goodbye. It was the start of something. Because Susan may have taken the house. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And 1 month later, everything she took would be mine. My name is Laura Whitmore. I'm 30 years old, and for the past 5 years I've worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm in Seattle. I'm the kind of person most people overlook: quiet, precise, someone you trust with details but never quite remember at the party. I'm not flashy, I don't raise my voice, but I listen, I read, I remember. When my mother died during my senior year of high school, it was like the gravity in our home shifted. My father, Gregory Whitmore, tried his best to keep us both afloat. He was a structural engineer, calm, methodical, and always home by 6. We were close in the way that doesn't need words. We were just solid. After college, I moved back home temporarily to help him manage things. That temporary stay turned into 8 years. I passed on job offers in other cities. I turned down a marriage proposal from someone who wanted to live in California. I stayed because my father's health began to decline. First small things like forgetting appointments, then larger issues like fainting spells and blood pressure crashes. I took on the role of caretaker, not because I had to, but because he had been there for me every day of my life, and leaving him alone didn't feel like a choice. 2 years ago, everything changed. My father met Susan at a community fundraiser. She was charming, polished, 10 years younger than him. She worked in real estate and knew exactly how to talk to people like my dad men, who never quite saw manipulation coming when it was wrapped in a warm smile. I tried to like her. I really did. But she moved fast, too fast. Within 6 months, they were married. I had my doubts, but I said nothing. I told myself he deserved happiness, that maybe I was being overprotective. But from the moment she moved in, something shifted. The house became colder. My father smiled less. She redecorated everything, got rid of the old books, the chess set, even the antique globe he loved. Still, I stayed. I cared for him while she went on real estate trips and self-care retreats. When his heart finally gave out, I was the one holding his hand. Susan was in Miami. At the funeral, she wore designer sunglasses and cried like someone auditioning for grief. I gave her space. I didn't argue when she hosted guests in the house days later. I stayed in the background processing my loss quietly. But the moment she told me I had to leave, that this was now her husband's house as if I had never existed, I knew I wasn't just grieving a parent. I was waking up to betrayal. I wasn't just mourning. I was about to begin again. They thought I was just the daughter, just the quiet girl in the corner. But they forgot one thing: I worked in law. I knew the system, I knew how to read between the lines. And above all, I knew how to wait. My father passed away on a Tuesday morning just before sunrise. I was the only one in the room when it happened. He had been in and out of consciousness for days, and the nurses warned me that it could be any moment. I held his hand, spoke softly, and read aloud the last letter my mother had written him before she died. He didn't say anything, but just before his breathing stopped, he squeezed my hand. That was the last time anyone treated me like family. The funeral was quiet, modest, just how he would have wanted. I handled everything from the flowers to the obituary, while Susan stayed mostly on her phone fielding condolences like she was managing a PR event. She cried when people were looking and scrolled when they weren't. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My grief didn't need to be performative. But the real storm hit 3 days after the memorial. I came downstairs with a mug of tea, and Susan was sitting at the kitchen island with her son Ryan. He was 25, full of swagger and nothing else, no job, no ambition, just a history of dropped community college classes and credit card debt. "We're making some changes," Susan said, stirring her coffee like she was announcing a kitchen remodel. "This house feels too heavy with your father's things. We need a fresh start." I asked. Ryan smirked and tossed a house key onto the counter. "We're moving in. I'm taking the upstairs bedroom. Mom will stay in the master." "You mean you're staying here?" I asked. Susan raised an eyebrow. "This is my husband's house. It passed to me." I froze. "There's no will?" "There doesn't need to be," she said quickly. "Everything was joint. The house is in both our names. You're welcome to collect your things and find somewhere else to stay for a while. I'm sure you'll land on your feet." I stood there staring at her. The kitchen still smelled like my father's cedarwood and cinnamon. The clock on the wall still ticked in the same rhythm he loved, and this woman was handing it off like it was a rental. "Where should I go?" I asked. "Back to that tiny apartment of yours," Susan said, not looking up. "Or, I don't know. You work at a law firm. I'm sure you know how to navigate the world. This place, it's not yours anymore." I didn't respond. Ryan walked past me like I was invisible, heading upstairs with a duffel bag. I could hear the creak of the third step, the one my dad always meant to fix. I went to the hallway closet, took out a box of old letters, my dad's favorite sweater, and the urn with his ashes. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I left quietly and drove away with my car filled with the only things that mattered. But as I turned the corner of our street, I looked into the rearview mirror, not at the house, but at myself. And I knew something they didn't. The law isn't just paperwork. It's leverage. And no matter how bold they were now, it only takes one document, one signature, to unravel everything. I wasn't just leaving behind memories, I was giving them rope. Enough to hang themselves. I moved into a modest extended stay motel 20 minutes from the house, paid for 2 weeks up front, and told no one from work where I was living. My colleagues assumed I needed time off to grieve, and I let them believe that. In a way, it was true. I was grieving, but not just for my father. I was mourning the illusion that family protected its own, that loyalty was rewarded. I had spent nearly a decade prioritizing my father's care over my own ambitions, my relationships, my independence, and in the end, all I got was a locked front door and an eviction notice delivered with a smirk. But even as I unpacked my things in a motel room that smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, I didn't feel like I had lost. I felt like I was rebooting. My father had taught me to solve problems one step at a time. Structure is everything, he used to say. You build from the foundation. You don't just throw up walls. So I sat on the bed, opened my laptop, and started building. First, I made a list: assets, documents, timelines. I checked the county records. The house was indeed listed in both my father's and Susan's names, but it had been purchased before they were married. That mattered. In Washington, property acquired before marriage typically remains separate unless it's explicitly converted. My father had never mentioned adding her to the deed. That meant either she had convinced him later, or she had done it without him fully understanding. Either way, I needed proof. I remembered my father's habit of scanning everything. He kept backups of all legal documents in a cloud folder I had helped him set up years ago. I logged in with his old email and password. He never changed them. Within minutes, I found a folder labeled House Deed and Assets. The original purchase contract was there, signed solely by him in 2004. I checked for any amendments, quitclaims, or addendums that would add Susan's name. There was one dated just 6 months before he died, scanned as a PDF with no notary stamp. That alone didn't mean it was fraudulent, but it did raise questions. I downloaded everything and backed it up twice. Then I made another list: people who could vouch for my role in my father's care, our relationship, his intentions, his doctor, our longtime neighbor, Mrs. Langston, even his accountant. Slowly, piece by piece, I was reconstructing the truth, not the version Susan was selling, but the one that would hold up in court. They thought I walked away in silence because I was weak. But silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's just the sound of strategy. Each day after work, I returned to the motel and slipped into a different role. The version of me that didn't just follow legal processes, but studied them, twisted them, and found the gaps others overlooked. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to dismantle their illusion of control piece by piece. The first real break came when I visited my father's old office, a small converted den in the back of the house that Susan had likely ignored because it didn't match her aesthetic. I'd kept a backup key, one my father had made for emergencies. I waited until I was sure Susan and Ryan were out, then let myself in through the side door and moved quickly. The room was just as he left it. A bookshelf filled with engineering manuals, a jar of fountain pens, a corkboard with clippings about structural design. But what I needed was in the filing cabinet under the desk, labeled Will Drafts. There were multiple versions, none notarized, but all dated and signed. The most recent one was written 3 months before his death. In it, he named me as the sole inheritor of his separate property, including the house, his car, and all contents within. He wrote that Susan was well supported by her own income and does not require additional assets. That sentence would prove crucial. I took photos of every page, returned the documents exactly as I found them, and left without a trace. Next, I began tracking Ryan. I already knew he was reckless, but I wanted proof. I hired a private investigator, Margot, an old contact from a previous legal case who owed me a favor. She shadowed him for 2 weeks and returned with exactly what I expected. Ryan was deep in gambling debt. He frequented an illegal poker ring in West Seattle and twice had tried to use real estate access as collateral, meaning he'd been telling people he had control over the house. He didn't, not legally. But that lie would be useful. Meanwhile, Susan was trying to sell off my father's belongings. Margot sent me photos from a local consignment shop. My father's vintage record player, the antique globe from his study, even framed engineering certificates. She wasn't just redecorating, she was erasing him, and in doing so, she was building my case. I met with a probate attorney named Helen Jennings, a sharp, calm woman in her 50s with a reputation for cutting through manipulative estate claims like a scalpel. I laid out the deeds, the scanned will, the unsigned notary, the PI's report. "You've got more than most people bring in," she said, flipping through the pages. "And if you're telling me Susan's already liquidating his assets, that's a huge red flag." "What's our first step?" I asked. Helen smiled. "We file an emergency motion to freeze all activity tied to that house and initiate a contest of ownership. They'll get served within the week. And Laura, don't be surprised if they panic." That was the first time I exhaled in days. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building the case brick by brick. My father used to say that every structure has a weak point. All you have to do is find it and press. I'd found theirs. It was built on arrogance, on assuming I'd just vanish. They thought they'd inherited a house. What they'd actually inherited was a fight they weren't ready for. Helen filed the motion first thing Monday morning. By Wednesday, the court had issued a temporary restraining order on any sale or transfer of property related to my father's estate. The house was legally frozen. Susan could live in it, but she couldn't touch it. Not sell it, not rent it, not even repaint it without violating the order. I imagined her waking up to that piece of paper taped to the front door by a court officer, the seal of the county sitting like a warning. But I wasn't done. Helen and I filed a second motion contesting Susan's claim of ownership. Our position was simple. The house had been my father's separate property, and the late attempt to add her name was suspect, especially when compared against his unsigned will. We backed our argument with county records banking statements, showing he paid the mortgage alone for 15 years before marrying her, and statements from neighbors who attested that my father had often referred to the home as Laura's inheritance. But the most damning piece came from a surveillance video. My father, weeks before he died, had visited his lawyer's office. I found the firm listed on a sticky note inside his desk drawer. The receptionist there, a woman named Tina, remembered him vividly. He didn't want a new will, she told me, just wanted advice on protecting the house from, his words were, potential opportunists. We requested access to the building's security feed and received footage of him entering and leaving that day. Time-stamped, clear. It reinforced the timeline that he was actively managing his affairs independently, even near the end. The court loved that. Susan, on the other hand, did not. She showed up to the preliminary hearing in a navy pantsuit flanked by a defense attorney she could barely afford. Ryan sat 2 rows behind her chewing gum like a child at a school assembly. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the judge. Helen presented our case cleanly, methodical, logical, unemotional. Every point was backed by paper photo footage or sworn statement. Susan's attorney argued that Gregory's intent had been to share the house with her, but when asked for proof, he offered only her word. That wasn't enough. The judge extended the freeze order and set a full hearing for the following month. We left the courtroom without saying a word to Susan. She followed us into the hallway. "You're doing this out of spite," she hissed. "He wanted me to have it." I turned to her for the first time since the funeral. "Then you should have made sure the paperwork matched that story." "You're punishing me." "No, I'm protecting him." She laughed brittle and sharp. "What's the end game, Laura? You think you're going to live there alone forever, clinging to his ghost?" I didn't answer, because it wasn't about living in the house. It was about making sure she didn't erase the man who built it. Meanwhile, Ryan was unraveling fast. The PI reported that he'd missed several loan payments and started pawning electronics. Word around the poker circuit was that he'd promised someone a payout after a real estate deal closed. That, coupled with Susan's sudden visit to a shady mortgage broker, suggested they were trying to refinance the house behind the court's back. We documented everything. Then we made our next move. Helen filed a motion for an emergency injunction claiming potential fraud and misrepresentation. The judge approved it within 48 hours. Susan was summoned for a financial disclosure hearing. That was when everything fell apart. Under oath, she admitted to selling items from the home. She claimed they were hers. We produced receipts showing the purchases were made by my father years before they met. The judge's demeanor shifted. "You're liquidating estate assets before the probate process is complete," she said flatly. "That's not just unethical. That's potentially criminal." Ryan tried to speak, but was silenced by a warning glare from the bailiff. The hearing ended with a formal notice. A full audit of Susan's financial dealings related to the estate would begin immediately. She was also barred from entering the home without a court-appointed monitor. A week later, the monitor called me personally. "You should come see what's left," she said. "It's sad." I walked through the house, escorted, seeing it for the first time in a month. Most of my father's personal effects were gone. Family photos, his chessboard, the globe. But what remained was enough. The bones of the home were intact. And legally, so was my case. The final blow came when Helen received a call from Susan's own defense team. They wanted to negotiate. They're offering to vacate the house voluntarily. Helen told me, "If you agree not to pursue criminal charges for asset misappropriation." I took a moment. "Tell them I'll agree," I said. "But only if they return everything they sold or pay for its replacement." "You're sure?" Helen asked. "We can bury them if you want." "I don't want to bury them," I replied. "I want them out. And I want the house back." 2 days later, Susan and Ryan left under supervision. No press, no neighbors, no drama. Just a quiet departure from a war they thought they'd already won. But I hadn't just taken the house back. I'd reclaimed the truth. The silence from Susan lasted only a week before the retaliation began. Not legal, not strategic, but emotional. The kind of chaos people create when their backs are against the wall, and they don't understand how they lost. First came the phone calls. Unblocked, unfiltered, unpredictable. I didn't answer, but the voicemails accumulated like debris after a storm. "You're heartless," one said. You think your father would be proud of this? Another was quieter, more venomous. You're a bitter little girl with no family left. Enjoy your empty house. Then came the rumors. Susan started visiting neighbors, presenting herself as a grieving widow, unfairly pushed out of her marital home by a cold, manipulative stepdaughter. I knew this because Mrs. Langston, the neighbor next door, who'd known me since childhood, called to warn me. She's knocking on every door, she said. But people aren't buying it. We all knew who really lived in that house. We saw who took care of your father. Still, it spread. At the grocery store, I noticed stares. A cashier who used to greet me with warmth barely made eye contact. Even one of my coworkers, gently misled by Susan's version of the story, asked if I was doing okay after all that drama with your stepmom. I smiled and said I was fine, because the truth didn't need defending in whispers or gossip. It stood in court orders and sworn affidavits. Meanwhile, Ryan spiraled. The investigator reported that his debts had caught up with him. He'd been assaulted outside a bar, possibly over unpaid poker losses. Word reached me that he was blaming me for destroying his future. But I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd only refused to let them steal what wasn't theirs. Susan tried to push back through her lawyer, suggesting a revised settlement, claiming emotional distress, even hinting at a harassment complaint. But everything they attempted fell apart under scrutiny. Every lie contradicted court records. Every accusation lacked evidence. Helen handled each response with quiet efficiency. Let them scramble, she told me. They're reacting emotionally. You're working systematically. You've already won. And she was right. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Walking through a neighborhood where I'd once been welcomed, now viewed with suspicion by those who only heard half the story, was a different kind of grief. But I reminded myself of something my father once told me. Reputation is what others think of you. Character is what you know about yourself. And I knew who I was. I didn't take revenge. I took back what was mine. The final hearing arrived on a crisp Thursday morning. I wore a black suit, simple earrings, and carried nothing but a leather folder containing every document I might need. Helen walked beside me, calm as always, her expression unreadable. Susan and Ryan were already seated when we entered the courtroom. She wore another expensive pantsuit, but this time there was a tension in her shoulders she couldn't hide. Ryan looked pale, jittery, like someone running on caffeine and anxiety. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with no patience for theatrics, entered and immediately got to work. We are here to finalize the matter of Gregory Whitmore's estate and the contested ownership of the residential property at 4127 Pine Hollow Drive. Helen stood and delivered our case with clarity, presenting the deed history, the late-stage will, the lack of notarization on Susan's added ownership claim, and the pattern of behavior that suggested intent to exploit rather than preserve. She also detailed the unauthorized liquidation of estate assets, listing each item with photographic evidence and their approximate value. Susan's attorney tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a woman acting out of grief, unsure of what belonged to whom, overwhelmed by loss. But the timeline betrayed that narrative. She hadn't acted in confusion. She had acted with strategy and entitlement. The judge reviewed the document slowly, asked a few sharp questions, and then folded her hands. Based on the preponderance of evidence, I rule in favor of Laura Whitmore, she said. The property located at 4127 Pine Hollow Drive shall be legally recognized as separate property belonging to Gregory Whitmore, and by his will and estate documentation shall transfer in full to his daughter, Laura Whitmore. I heard Susan's breath catch beside me. The judge continued. Furthermore, the court finds sufficient concern regarding the unauthorized sale of estate items, and will refer this matter to the probate division for further review. Restitution may be required. She banged the gavel once. That was it. Clean. Final. Precise. Susan turned to me as I stood to leave her mouth slightly open, her voice too soft to be called a whisper. You really did all this. Just to hurt me. I paused, met her eyes for the first time in weeks. No, I did all this so you'd stop hurting him. Ryan said nothing. He was already looking at the floor as if trying to disappear. Later that afternoon, a sheriff served the formal eviction notice. Susan had 48 hours to vacate. I didn't return to the house immediately. I let the hours pass like water, quiet and steady. I wanted them to feel the weight of being pushed out to understand what it meant to be powerless in a place they once thought was theirs. When I finally returned, the front door stood ajar. The house was mostly empty. They had taken what they could but left behind the things they didn't recognize as valuable. My father's books, his tools, the framed letter from his alma mater. They saw no use in the artifacts of his life. But I did. I walked through each room breathing in the silence. No more shouting, no more cold glances over breakfast. Just space and memory and something new, peace. I stood in the kitchen, placed my hand on the counter and whispered, "I brought it all back, Dad. Everything you gave me, I protected it." Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, the foundation held firm. 3 days after the court ruling, my phone rang. The caller ID said Susan. I stared at it for a long moment, then answered. I didn't speak first. "Laura," she said, her voice thin and strained. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I was hoping we could talk." "We're talking," I replied calmly. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for days. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I was angry. Lost. I thought I was protecting myself, but I see now how much I hurt you." "You didn't just hurt me," I said. "You erased him. Or you tried to." "That wasn't my intention," she murmured. "Intentions don't excuse outcomes," I answered. "You removed photos, sold his belongings, claimed his house, lied to the court. That's not confusion, that's calculation." There was a pause, then her voice cracked. "I loved him too, you know." "Then you should have honored what he built." Silence again. Then a quieter plea. "Do you think we can move forward?" "Maybe someday you and I could." "No," I said gently. "We can't. But you forgave me. In court, you didn't press charges. I forgave you," I said, "because I refused to carry your poison. But that doesn't mean I trust you. Or that you're welcome in my life." She started to respond, but I cut her off. "You made your choices, Susan. Now live with them. You still have your business, your contacts, your charm. Rebuild however you want. But don't call me again." Her voice was barely audible. "I understand." I ended the call and sat in the quiet for a long time. That conversation hadn't been about closure for her. It had been about hope. Hope that I'd undo the consequences. But some bridges don't burn with fire. They dissolve in silence. And I wasn't interested in rebuilding what had never truly stood on solid ground. That evening, I walked through the house and placed back my father's favorite books on the shelf. I dusted off his framed photographs, lit a candle near the urn that now rested above the fireplace, and poured a glass of wine. Not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Justice had been done. But peace. Peace came from knowing I could finally stop fighting and start living. Alone, whole, unshaken. The next morning I woke early, not from an alarm, but from something quieter and deeper, a sense of stillness that hadn't touched me in months. The house breathed differently now. Not louder, not fuller, just lighter. I walked through the rooms barefoot, feeling the cool wood under my feet, the morning light slipping through the curtains. The house wasn't just mine again. It was mine for the first time. Not because it had been handed to me, but because I had taken it back deliberately, patiently, with the same discipline my father taught me when he showed me how to solve equations, fix a broken faucet, or stand my ground without ever raising my voice. I spent the afternoon restoring the small things, framing the photos Susan had boxed away, hanging my father's engineering license in the office, reorganizing his toolbox in the garage. I planted flowers in the garden he once loved, the same marigolds and violets my mother used to grow before she passed. Each act, however small, felt like placing a stone back in a wall that had been cracked but never crumbled. That evening, I found a letter tucked inside a hardcover journal my father kept. It wasn't addressed to me, but I knew he meant for me to read it. It spoke of gratitude, fear, and an awareness of time running out. In it, he wrote, "I don't know what will happen when I'm gone, but I know who you are, and that's enough for me." I closed the letter and placed it in a drawer, not as evidence, not as leverage, but as a memory, a reminder. Outside, the neighborhood had returned to its routine. Lawnmowers, barking dogs, sprinklers ticking on and off. But something inside me had shifted permanently. I wasn't the daughter anymore. Not in the way people think of daughters who follow, who wait, who rely on someone else to lead. I had become something else, the protector of legacy, the last witness, the quiet storm they never saw coming. And yet it wasn't vengeance that stayed with me. It wasn't even triumph. It was something softer, dignity, boundaries drawn with reason, not rage, justice earned without cruelty. I stood at the doorway as the sun dipped low behind the trees and whispered, "I did it right, Dad. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but right. And sometimes that's all that matters."